In July of 1518, in the bustling medieval city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the narrow street outside her home and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration, no reason at all. She simply danced, her feet moving in frantic, jerking motions as neighbors gathered to watch what they assumed was madness or perhaps a cruel joke. But Frau Trophia didn't stop, not when the sun set and darkness fell over the timber-framed houses, not when her husband begged her to come inside, not when her feet began to bleed. For 6 days straight, she danced without ceasing, her body moving as though controlled by invisible strings, her face a mask of exhaustion and terror. And then, something far worse happened. Others began to join her. Within a week, 34 people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg, their bodies convulsing in the same relentless rhythm. Within a month, the number had swollen to nearly 400. These were not revelers or festival-goers. They were bakers and merchants, mothers and fathers, people who had lives and responsibilities, now trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes that seemed pulled from a fever dream. Men and women danced until their feet were raw and bleeding, leaving trails of crimson on the cobblestones. They danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, and when they awoke, they began dancing again. Some danced until their hearts simply gave out. Medical records and city council documents from the period confirm that dozens died, their bodies pushed beyond all human limits by whatever force had seized control of them. The city authorities were utterly baffled. This wasn't a disease they recognized. There were no lesions, no fever, no symptoms except the dancing itself. The local physicians, trained in the medieval understanding of humors and miasmas, examined the afflicted and could find no physical cause. Some suggested it was a curse, others whispered about demonic possession. The priests were called in to perform exorcisms, but the dancing continued unabated. In desperation, the city council made a decision that seems almost incomprehensible to modern minds. They decided that the dancers needed to dance it out of their systems. Stages were constructed in the town square. Professional musicians were hired to play. Dancers were brought to these stages and encouraged to continue, with the theory that exhausting whatever compulsion had taken hold would finally free them. Instead, more people joined the dance. The atmosphere in Strasbourg became apocalyptic. Families locked their doors, terrified that they or their children would be next. Business ground to a halt as shops closed and markets emptied. The sound of frantic footsteps and labored breathing echoed through streets that should have been filled with commerce and conversation. At night, when most of the city tried to sleep, the dancing continued, a constant reminder that something was deeply, terribly wrong. Witnesses described the dancers' eyes as glazed and distant, as though they were looking at something no one else could see. Some cried as they danced, others laughed, a few screamed. But none of them could stop. The medieval mind struggled to comprehend what was happening, reaching for explanations rooted in religion and superstition because medicine offered no answers. If you're finding yourself drawn into this mystery, wondering what could possibly cause such horror, then subscribe to this channel, because we're diving deep into history's darkest corners, uncovering the stories that haunt us across centuries. These aren't just tales. They're real events that changed real lives, and understanding them helps us understand the fragility of the human mind and the mysteries that still elude us. As the death toll mounted and panic spread through Strasbourg, the city's leaders grew increasingly desperate. They consulted with physicians from neighboring towns, sent urgent messages to medical universities, and sought the council of astrologers who studied the positions of the stars for signs of cosmic disturbance. Meanwhile, the dancers continued their macabre performance, some now having been in motion for weeks. Their bodies, pushed beyond all reasonable limits, began to break down in horrifying ways. But the true terror of the dancing plague wasn't just what was happening, it was that no one understood why. The explanations offered by medieval authorities reveal as much about the time period as they do about the plague itself. The prevailing theory among physicians was that the dancing was caused by hot blood, an imbalance of humors that drove the afflicted to move uncontrollably. Astrologers blamed a conjunction of planets that had released malevolent influences into the earthly realm. The Catholic Church took a different approach, declaring that the dancers had been cursed by Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr whose wrath could supposedly cause involuntary movement as divine punishment for sin. This interpretation led to a pilgrimage. The dancers were loaded onto carts and wagons, still writhing and moving, and transported to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus in the nearby Vosges Mountains. There, priests performed elaborate rituals, sprinkling holy water and offering prayers for deliverance. Remarkably, the dancing began to subside. Whether through genuine belief, sheer exhaustion, or the change of environment, the afflicted gradually stopped moving. By early September, the dancing plague had ended as mysteriously as it had begun. But the story doesn't end with that apparent miracle. Modern researchers have spent centuries trying to understand what really happened in Strasbourg in 1518, and the theories they've developed are almost as disturbing as the event itself. One prominent explanation suggests ergot poisoning, a condition caused by consuming grain contaminated with a fungus that produces compounds similar to LSD. Ergot poisoning can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and involuntary muscle contractions. However, this theory has significant problems. Ergot poisoning typically causes victims to curl up in agony, not dance for days on end. It also affects entire communities indiscriminately, yet the dancing plague struck individuals across different families and social classes in a pattern that doesn't match a contaminated food source. The more widely accepted modern explanation is even more unsettling because it suggests that the mind itself can become the source of such horror. Historians and psychologists now believe the dancing plague was a case of mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon where psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms that spread through a community. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city under immense stress. A series of failed harvests had brought famine. Diseases including smallpox and syphilis were ravaging the population. The social order was fracturing under economic pressure and religious tension. People were terrified, desperate, and looking for explanations for their suffering. In this context, when Frau Troffea began dancing, she may have been expressing psychological anguish in the only way her traumatized mind could manage. And when others saw her, their own suppressed terror and stress found the same outlet. What makes mass psychogenic illness so disturbing is that it demonstrates how fragile the boundary between mind and body really is. These people weren't faking, they genuinely couldn't control their movements. Their belief that they were cursed or possessed became so powerful that it overrode their conscious will, turning thought into physical reality. Similar events have occurred throughout history, from the medieval nunneries where entire convents would suddenly begin meowing like cats or barking like dogs, to modern cases of mass hysteria in schools and factories. The dancing plague of 1518 stands out because of its scale, its duration, and its deadly consequences, but the underlying mechanism, the way collective fear can manifest as collective illness, remains a part of human psychology that we still don't fully understand. The aftermath of the dancing plague left Strasbourg traumatized. Families had lost loved ones in one of the most bizarre ways imaginable. The city's economy had been disrupted. Trust in both medical and religious authorities had been shaken. But perhaps most disturbing was the lingering question that haunted survivors. If the mind could betray the body so completely, if belief and fear could literally dance someone to death, then what other horrors might be lurking in the depths of human consciousness? The dancing plague ended, but its shadow stretched across the centuries, a reminder that sometimes the darkest mysteries aren't about external forces or supernatural curses. Sometimes the horror comes from within, from the parts of ourselves we can't fully understand or control. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's most disturbing unsolved mysteries, not because we lack theories, but because the most likely explanation forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature. We are more fragile than we like to admit. Our minds, when pushed by stress, fear, and collective trauma, can turn against us in ways that seem impossible. Those dancers in Strasbourg weren't possessed by demons or cursed by saints. They were ordinary people driven to extraordinary horror by circumstances that made their internal anguish too powerful to contain. And in our own age of anxiety, economic uncertainty, and social stress, their story serves as a haunting reminder that the line between sanity and collective madness is thinner than we'd like to believe.